Well, I'm very happy to be here this morning and appreciate you all turning out not only for the breakfast, but to hear me talk about the Supreme Court. I have a formal title for it, and I think it sums up the story. It's called Last Term of the Supreme Court, No Standout Constitutional Decisions, but Justice Kennedy decides all the major close ones. I want to do four things in this talk this morning. First, I want to outline the past term of the court. It's a sharply divided court. It's basically 5 conservative versus 4 liberal-leaning justices, and that's generally been the case for more than 40 years. Really, since the end of the Warren Court, that has been the lineup, with the exception of a 2-year hiatus between that didn't last very long, obviously. Second, I want to discuss what this past term and a few preceding ones tell us about each of the justices, especially but not only the 4 most recent appointees to the bench. Third, I want to take a relatively quick look at some of the more significant rulings last term in the course of discussing what the sitting justices are all about, and I'd like to take about 10 minutes at the end to get any complaints, criticisms, questions, or what happened. So you can begin with what the media wrap-up of the terms last July had to say. They tell some, I think, but not the most important part of the story of the term. For example, the Times opened up by saying, First Amendment dominates, unquote. Well, that's true, but it's much more descriptive of just what the docket happened to be on any particular year than anything significant about what they did. The Wall Street Journal said, and I quote, "Court conservatives prevail." That's true, but no more so than the last 6 years. Nonetheless, we're going to see not all that much anyway, but it's no more so than the last 6 years when Justice Sandra Day O'Connor was replaced by Samuel Alito, making a significant difference. Atlantic Magazine echoed a theme that's around generally, and that's a quote, "A very conservative court," all right? Comma, as has been conservative as it's been as conservative as has been in 75 years. Well, you remember a couple of years ago at the State of the Union speech when President Obama pretty harshly criticized the decision of the court that term involving campaign finance spending by corporations and unions, and he characterized it, the president did, as I say, quite unusually, as a decision that he didn't think was very good. And Justice Alito there, he didn't say it out loud, but you could read his lips. He simply said, "Not true." I would say the same thing about the Atlantic's headline. We'll talk about that. It is not as conservative as it's been in 75 years. Last term they had a total of about 80 cases. Nearly half of them were unanimous. That tells you quite a bit. But I counted those 80, 31 decisions that involved a constitutional or near constitutional issue that lent themselves to being characterized as giving the court a choice between a conservative or a liberal decision. Not all of them do that. You take interpretations of the bankruptcy code, for example, or the Internal Revenue Code. They're really not liberal or conservative, but the individual rights cases and the big constitutional cases usually are. So a word of definition, what are these terms? We hear them all the time, and we hear them not only in the political arena, but as describing judges and justices of the Supreme Court as well. What does it mean in respect to constitutional decision making? Well, I want to give you really a pretty quick, but somewhat, look, everything is oversimplified when you try to do it quickly, but nonetheless I think it's pretty accurate. And what is the significant differences, what are they, between conservative and liberal Supreme Court decisions, justices in respect to constitutional decision making. There are a number of categories of cases. You have those which have a clash between individual rights and government regulations. In most cases, liberals tend to favor the individual rights, conservatives tend to favor the government regulations, with a major exception that I'm going to point out several times during the course of this talk. And that is, at least in respect to non-economic rights that favor minorities. Those are the kinds where the liberals vote for them, the conservatives vote against them. But if you have an economic right that tends to favor larger groups of people, and I'll give some examples of these, that protects, as I should say, larger groups of people, like the prohibition against taking without just compensation. All right? That protects everybody, rich, poor, whatever you are. There's a flip-flop under those circumstances. And that is that the conservatives tend to favor the individual rights and the liberals don't. Second, liberals tend to favor broad national power. Conservatives tend to favor states' rights. That's something I think that we're generally familiar with. And a carryover of that is that liberals will favor an expansive role for the federal judiciary, whereas conservative justices tend to look to the states for resolution of greater series of questions. And then finally, conservatives are more likely to uphold executive power, the presidential power, believing in a stronger executive, whereas the liberals will tend to favor a greater participation of Congress, restricting the power of the president, especially, but not only, as unfortunately we are now concerned in time of war. All right, so there you have it, and I'll give a bunch of examples of that as I go through the term. So as I said, there were 31 decisions last term that involved constitutional or constitutional-like statutory interpretations. What about them? Or that lent themselves to this characterization. What about them? Well, exclude 9 of the 31. They were unanimous decisions. Once again, not that they're no-brainers, but they're pretty close, all right? Interestingly, all of which came out in favor of the conservatives, given the definitions that I've given. A bunch of them, I guess, for this audience, a number of them were overturning pro-criminal rights decisions of the Ninth Circuit. I don't, the Ninth Circuit gets much more abused than America. But that is a certain hallmark that goes on a number of terms in which they get overturned per curiam in that way. Okay, so what happened with the 31 minus 9? You can take out your phones there, and it's 22. Lawyers are not big on arithmetic, mathematics. And if you take those 22, how'd they break down? Well, the conservatives won 14, the liberals won 8. You might say, well, the conservatives did pretty well. I think the liberals did pretty well. Where you're 4 and you got 5 on the other side, you can win 8 out of 22. That's not too bad. The 5-4 decisions that are often the most revealing are often the most revealing. And there were 13 of them, of these 31 cases, right? 5-4, compared to only 7 in the preceding year. How'd they come out? 7-6 conservative. That is, I think, quite good for a minority to get 6 out of the 13. Again, it was sort of similar to last year, but I want to say that neither of the liberal performances, if you will, were as good as when Justice O'Connor was on the court. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as I go through the last term. Most interesting for me, that if you took 5 of the most significant or highly publicized decisions, and you'll recall I titled the talk by saying no real standout, blockbuster constitutional decisions last year. But if you take the 5 most, at least highly publicized, significant, and this is really my own arbitrary choice. I mean, this is not there's no poll on this sort of thing. The 5, I would say, one I'm not really going to talk about much more, was the Walmart case, which substantially limited the ability of federal class actions, all right, with Walmart employees. What it is, I mean, it's not my area, but Look, I mean, you can distinguish the case right down the road if you want and say, look, this was a very special kind of case. This was all of the class, the sought-after class was every female employee of Walmart. And I mean, there's lots in the opinion that suggest, this is just unmanageable, particularly defining all common issues, all issues common to them all. All right. The second, I would say, very highly publicized, is one I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and that's the California prison case, in which the court ruled that California is going to have to reduce its prison population in order to conform with a ruling of the Ninth Circuit, saying that the conditions were cruel and unusual punishment. The third also involved the court declaring unconstitutional a California statute which made it a crime to sell violent video games to minors. I am going to talk about that case. The fourth was the so-called military funeral case. You all remember that, where there was this demonstration against a lot of things going on in the country by a very conservative organization outside the funeral of a dead soldier, I believe, coming back either from Iran or excuse me, from Afghanistan or Iraq. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the fifth was a campaign spending case, which are always pretty hotly contested, coming out of Arizona, which I'll talk about also. So take those 5 cases. How'd they come out? 3-2 liberal under that situation. So once again, I just want to say this is not the most conservative term in the last most conservative court in the last 75 years. I turn now to making some observations on the individual justices, and I'll give more time to some than others, but I'll talk at least some about all 9. Since the beginning of what I would call the Kennedy Court, because that's what it is. I mean, Chief Justice may be John Roberts, but Anthony Kennedy of Northern California, he calls the tune on anything significant. He's become, I'm going to make a strong statement now, but I think it's true. He has become the single most influential justice in the history of the Supreme Court. Certainly in the last 40 years, 40 plus years since the end of the Warren Court. There have been different ones that have different ones, and what do I mean by that? Different ones on the conservative side. The 4 liberals are able to pull over and make a 5-4 liberal decision. I mean, that's really in the ones that really separate the men from the boys, if you will, the women from the girls, is those kinds of cases. It's where the 4 liberals, look, they're split in a very traditional fashion, and they pull one over. Well, there have been different ones, as I say, since the end of the Warren Court, beginning with Potter Stewart, Byron White, Lewis Powell, then Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and finally both she and Kennedy were able to be pulled over. But since 2005, when Justice O'Connor retired, the bottom line is that Justice Kennedy is the only game in town. And he's the one that you've got to pull over if you're going to make it.